The phone rang during dinner on a Tuesday evening. The sound cutting through our quiet meal of roasted chicken and rice, and my husband Cameron reached for it casually, his fork still in his other hand, saying, "Work's calling," with that easy smile he always wore when he thought everything was under control. And he tapped the screen to answer on speaker without looking, probably expecting his supervisor or a client, but I was sitting directly across from him at our small dining table, close enough to see the screen clearly before he realized his mistake, and the contact name glowed bright against the dark background. Mom's lawyer. And my stomach dropped like I'd missed a step going downstairs, that sickening lurch of suddenly understanding something is very wrong. And Cameron's eyes flickered to the screen a half-second too late, his smile freezing in place. And he grabbed the phone and switched it off speaker so fast his hand was a blur, pressing it to his ear and standing abruptly, his chair scraping loud against our kitchen floor, saying into the phone, "Hey, yeah, give me 1 second," as he walked quickly toward his home office. And I sat there with my fork suspended halfway to my mouth, my heart pounding, because work doesn't have a contact name that says, "Mom's lawyer." Work doesn't make your hands shake, and your voice go tight with panic. And I heard his office door click shut, heard his muffled voice through the walls, but couldn't make out words. And I set down my fork carefully and stared at my plate, my mind racing through 100 possibilities, none of them good. Wondering why my husband's work call was actually from his mother's attorney, and more importantly, why he'd lied about it so smoothly, so automatically, like lying to me was something he'd practiced. My name is Brooke Patterson, I'm 47 years old, and until that Tuesday evening, I thought I knew exactly what my life looked like. A solid 15-year marriage to Cameron, a comfortable 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, a steady job as an office manager at a dental practice where I'd worked for 12 years, and a routine that felt safe even if it wasn't exciting. The kind of life where you know what to expect, where surprises are rare and usually pleasant, like finding $20 in an old coat pocket or getting home early on a Friday. But that phone call, that split-second glimpse of a contact name that didn't match the lie coming out of my husband's mouth, changed everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. I sat at that table alone, my dinner going cold, and I replayed Cameron's expression in my mind, the way his smile had frozen, the panic in his eyes, the speed with which he'd grabbed that phone and fled the room, and I recognized something I'd seen before but never wanted to name. Guilt. The unmistakable look of someone caught doing something they shouldn't, and his tone when he said "work's calling" had been too casual, too rehearsed, like he'd said those exact words many times before, and expected me to accept them without question the way I always had. I heard his office door open 20 minutes later, heard his footsteps coming back down the hall, and he returned to the table with that same easy smile firmly back in place, saying, "Sorry about that. Just some scheduling stuff for next week." And I looked at him directly and said, "Okay," without inflecting it as a question. And I didn't confront him, didn't demand explanations, didn't let my face show the fear and confusion churning in my chest. Because something in my gut told me that the truth here was bigger than one phone call. And I needed to understand the full picture before I showed my hand. I started paying attention after that, watching patterns I'd previously ignored because I'd trusted my husband completely. And over the next week, I noticed the same thing happening repeatedly. Cameron's phone would ring during dinner, or right after his mother Diane visited on Sunday afternoons, or while we were watching television in the evening, and he'd glance at the screen. His shoulders would tense almost imperceptibly, and he'd say, "Let me grab this," or "work thing," or "client follow-up," always something vaguely professional sounding, and he'd walk away to take the call privately. And I started checking the call log on our shared phone account online, something I'd never done before because I'd never had reason to doubt him, and there it was. The same number appearing weekly, sometimes twice weekly, always in the early evening hours, always lasting 15 to 30 minutes, and the number matched our phone carrier's notation for frequent contacts. And when I cross-referenced the timing, every single call happened either during dinner or within an hour after his mother had left our house. Cameron's behavior changed subtly during those calls. I'd hear his voice through the walls, not the words but the tone, and it was different from how he spoke to actual work contacts. It was careful and tense and sometimes frustrated. And when he'd return to whatever we'd been doing, he'd be distracted for the rest of the evening, checking his phone repeatedly, his jaw tight with stress, and when I'd ask, "Everything okay?" he'd force a smile and say, "Yeah, just meetings running late, nothing to worry about." But his hands would shake slightly when he said it, a tremor I'd never noticed before, because I'd never been looking for lies. His mother had always been involved in our lives, visiting every Sunday, calling Cameron several times a week, offering opinions on our decisions, where we should vacation, what car we should buy, how we should manage our money. But I'd accepted it as normal because Cameron was an only child and Diane was a widow, and I'd thought her involvement came from loneliness rather than control. But now I wondered what I'd been missing. What had been happening in plain sight while I'd been too trusting or too tired to notice. Diane showed up at our house the next Thursday morning, unannounced, which wasn't unusual, but felt different now that I was paying attention. And I opened the door to find her standing on our porch with a bakery box of pastries and that warm smile she always wore when she wanted something, saying, "Good morning, sweetheart. I brought breakfast." And she walked past me into our kitchen like she owned it, setting the box on the counter and immediately filling our coffee maker. And I noticed how her eyes swept the room, cataloging details, lingering on the mail stacked on the counter, the calendar on our refrigerator, the folder of bills I'd left on the table, scanning everything with an intensity that felt invasive now that I was actually watching instead of just accepting. Cameron wasn't home. He'd left for work an hour earlier, and Diane knew his schedule perfectly. Knew exactly when I'd be alone. And she settled onto one of our kitchen stools and gestured for me to sit, saying, "We should talk, Brooke, about planning for the future." And something in her tone made my skin prickle, because it wasn't a suggestion, it was an announcement. And she continued, "Cameron and I have been discussing how to make sure you're both taken care of as you get older, making sure everything is organized properly, financially secure." And I sat across from her slowly, my coffee cup warm between my hands, and I said carefully, "That sounds thoughtful, but Cameron hasn't mentioned any of this to me." And Diane waved that away. "Oh, you know men, they don't like to worry their wives with details, but it's important, especially with how demanding your job has been lately, all that stress." And I hadn't told her my job was stressful. It wasn't particularly. And Cameron looked uncomfortable suddenly, like he wanted to be anywhere else. And Diane reached into her large purse and pulled out a folder, setting it on our kitchen counter, saying, "I had some documents drawn up, just preliminary, nothing official yet, but I wanted you to see them. Get your thoughts." And she slid the folder toward me, and when I opened it, I saw my name at the top of financial documents that mentioned restructuring and beneficiary changes and decision-making authority, and buried in the formal language were phrases about diminished capacity and protective measures. And my hands went cold, because I recognized this language from my job, where we occasionally dealt with estate planning and elderly patients. And this wasn't about protecting me, it was about limiting me. I read through the first page slowly, not reacting, keeping my face neutral the way I'd learned to do at work when dealing with difficult patients or unreasonable demands. And the document was titled Financial Planning and Asset Protection Agreement, with subsections about joint account management and authorization protocols. And buried in the third paragraph was language that would require my co-signature with Cameron for any transaction over $500, while Cameron would maintain unilateral access to everything. And further down was a clause about voluntary delegation of financial decision-making in circumstances of demonstrated incapacity, which was legal language designed to sound protective, but actually meant someone else could take control if they decided I wasn't capable. And I closed the folder carefully and looked up at Diane, who was watching me with barely concealed eagerness, and I said calmly, "This is interesting, but I'd like to review it with my own financial advisor before signing anything." And her smile flickered, just for a second, before she recovered and said, "Oh, honey, There's no need for that. Cameron and I already had it reviewed by a professional. It's all standard stuff. And I maintained my pleasant expression and repeated, I appreciate that, Diane, but I prefer to have my own advisor look at anything I'm signing, just to make sure I understand it fully. And the temperature in the kitchen dropped noticeably, and Diane's warmth evaporated like morning fog in sunlight. And she said with an edge in her voice, You don't trust us? And I replied evenly, I trust that everyone should understand documents before signing them. That's just good practice. And I slid the folder back across the counter toward her, and she stared at me for a long moment, something hard and calculating in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Or maybe I'd seen it many times but had never recognized it for what it was. Control. Pure and simple. The look of someone who just realized their target wasn't going to be as easy to manipulate as expected. And she gathered the folder slowly, her mouth tight, and said, We'll discuss this with Cameron tonight. And it sounded like a threat. Cameron came home that evening already angry, walking through the door with his jaw set and his shoulders tense. And he didn't kiss me hello the way he usually did, didn't ask about my day, just dropped his briefcase on the counter and said, What was that with my mother this morning? And I looked up from the vegetables I was chopping for dinner and said calmly, She brought over some documents she wanted me to sign. I told her I wanted my own advisor to review them first. That seemed reasonable, and Cameron's face flushed red, and he said, Why are you making this difficult, Brooke? She's trying to help us. And I set down my knife carefully and turned to face him fully, saying, How is it difficult to want to understand something before signing it? That's basic financial sense. And he shifted tactics, his voice going softer but somehow more dangerous. You've been different lately, emotional, questioning everything, like you don't trust us anymore. And there was that word, us, lumping himself together with his mother like they were a unit, and I was separate. And I started to respond, but his phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and I saw his thumb move to silence it, but not before I caught a glimpse of the notification. A text from his mother, visible in the preview. She's being difficult about the papers. And he looked up and caught me watching, and something guilty flashed across his face before he shoved the phone back in his pocket and said, I need to make a call. And he walked toward his office, and I heard him close the door, heard his voice through the walls, low and tense, and I moved quietly toward the hallway, not to eavesdrop exactly, but to understand what was happening in my own home. And I heard him say clearly, Yes, she's resisting. And then silence, while he listened. And then, I don't know, maybe we need to try a different approach. And my stomach twisted, because they were discussing me like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be overcome, and I backed away silently and returned to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I resumed chopping vegetables, and I realized that confronting Cameron directly would only make him more defensive, would only drive whatever this was further underground, and I needed to be smarter, quieter, more strategic about how I protected myself. I woke at 2 a.m. 3 days later, pulled from sleep by voices in the hallway outside our bedroom, low and careful, but not quite quiet enough, and Cameron's side of the bed was empty, the sheets cool, and I lay still in the darkness, barely breathing, listening to my husband's voice and his mother's voice murmuring just beyond our closed bedroom door. And I heard Diane say, She's more stubborn than we thought. And Cameron replied, She's always been independent, but lately it's worse, she's questioning everything. And Diane's voice dropped lower. What about the forgetfulness? Have you been documenting it? And Cameron said, There's been some small stuff, but I've been keeping notes like you said. And I felt ice run through my veins because I wasn't forgetful. My memory was fine, I managed complex scheduling at work daily without issue, but they were constructing a narrative, building a case against my competence with made-up evidence and careful documentation. And Diane continued, and the emotional instability. And Cameron hesitated before answering, She's been stressed. I can work with that. And I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound because this was real. This was actually happening. My husband and his mother were plotting in my hallway at 2 a.m, discussing my supposed deficiencies, like I was a project they were managing. And I heard Diane say, "The attorney said if she signs the papers, it's done. We'll have the structure in place, and then it's just a matter of time and proper documentation." And Cameron said quietly, "What if she won't sign?" And Diane's answer chilled me to my core. Then we moved to Plan B, the medical evaluation. We have grounds. And I lay there in the dark, my heart hammering, understanding, finally and completely, that this was not about helping me or protecting our future. This was about taking control, about making me legally subordinate, about stripping away my autonomy. And I didn't record the conversation because I knew recording without consent was illegal in our state, and I needed to do everything right, everything legal. But I listened and I remembered every word. And I committed to memory the tone in Cameron's voice. Not angry, not cruel, but resigned, like he'd accepted his mother's plan and was simply working through the steps to implement it. At work the next day, I sat across from Helen, my coworker who'd been with the dental practice even longer than I had, and during our lunch break in the small staff room, I told her everything in a calm, factual voice. The phone call with the contact name, the documents Diane had brought, the conversation I'd overheard at 2 a.m, and Helen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, Brooke, honey, you need to get your documents in order. Quietly, right now." And I asked, "What do you mean?" And she leaned forward, her voice low even though we were alone. "I had a friend years ago whose husband tried something similar. By the time she realized what was happening, he'd already frozen accounts, changed beneficiaries, built a legal case that she was incompetent. She barely got out with anything because she waited too long to protect herself." And fear clutched at my chest and I said, "But I haven't done anything wrong. I'm fine, I'm competent, surely that matters." And Helen's eyes were kind but serious. "In court, whoever has the best documentation wins. If they're building a case that you're unstable or forgetful or incapable, you need to build a stronger case that you're not. Medical records, work performance reviews, financial records showing good management. Evidence beats accusations, but you have to gather it now, before they make their next move." And she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "And Brooke, don't tell Cameron what you're doing. Not yet. Keep everything separate and secret until you understand the full picture and have protection in place." And I nodded, my throat tight with gratitude and fear. And that afternoon during my break, I searched online from my work computer, clearing my browser history afterward, looking for information about financial coercion and conservatorship and what rights I had. And what I found made me understand how serious this was. That if they could establish any grounds for questioning my capacity, even spurious grounds, they could petition a court for temporary authority while the matter was investigated, and temporary often became permanent. And by the time you proved you were fine, the damage was done, and your life had been rearranged without your consent. That evening, while Cameron was at the gym, I sat at our shared computer in the home office, my hands sweating as I opened the folders we used for household documents, and I found a new folder dated from 3 weeks earlier, labeled Estate Planning. And inside were multiple files I'd never seen before. Scanned drafts of documents similar to what Diane had shown me, but more extensive, more controlling, and one document titled Spousal Consent, Asset Reallocation, that would transfer primary ownership of our house to Cameron alone, change our joint investment accounts to his name with me as a secondary dependent, and establish him as sole decision-maker for all financial matters. And buried in the fine print was language about my diminished capacity to manage complex financial decisions, and increasing cognitive difficulties, lies presented as established facts, and there were printed email exchanges between Cameron and a law office I didn't recognize, conversations about the best approach to implement these changes, discussions about whether I'd sign voluntarily or if they'd need to pursue alternative legal remedies. And that phrase made my blood run cold because it wasn't ambiguous. It meant forcing compliance through legal action. I found a printout of a message thread between Cameron and his mother, and Diane had written, "The attorney says we need 3 witnesses willing to testify about behavioral changes. I have my book club friends lined up, and Cameron had responded, "What about her work? Anyone there?" And Diane replied, "Working on it. Someone owes me a favor." And I felt sick reading this because they were actively trying to recruit people to lie about me, to provide false testimony about made-up problems. And at the bottom of the folder was a single sheet of paper, a calendar page, with a date circled in red pen, 2 weeks away, May 15th, and next to it, someone had written in Diane's precise handwriting, "Evaluations scheduled," and I quickly photographed everything with my phone, sent the images to my personal email account that Cameron didn't have access to, and closed all the folders exactly as I'd found them, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And when Cameron came home, 30 minutes later, sweaty from the gym and cheerful, saying, "Hey babe, how was your day?" I smiled and said, "Good, just quiet," and served him dinner like nothing had changed. But everything had changed, because now I knew exactly what I was fighting. I made a conscious decision the next morning to become what they expected. Compliant, easy, unchallenging. Not because I'd surrendered, but because I needed them to relax, to stop watching me so carefully, to grow comfortable enough to make mistakes. And when Diane called that afternoon asking if I'd reconsidered the documents, I said in a tired voice, "You know what? I've been thinking about it, and maybe you're right. I've been stressed lately, and it might be easier if Cameron handles more of the finances." And the relief in her voice was palpable as she said, "Oh, Brooke, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. This is really for the best." And we talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, and I agreed to everything she suggested. Yes, I should probably cut back my hours at work. Yes, Cameron was so good with money. Yes, it would be nice to have less to worry about. And by the end of the call, she was warm and chatty again, convinced she'd won. And that evening, when Cameron came home, I was cooking his favorite dinner, and I was pleasant and agreeable and showed no signs of suspicion or resistance. And I watched him visibly relax over the next few days, his shoulders loosening, his smile becoming genuine again instead of forced. And Diane started visiting more frequently, and she'd talk freely in front of me now, no longer guarding her words, saying things like, "Once we get everything organized properly," and "after the evaluation confirms what we know." And once, chillingly, she said while I was in the kitchen making tea, "Once Brooke's medical situation is documented, the rest will be straightforward." And Cameron didn't correct her or question what she meant, he just nodded. And I stood at the counter with my back to them, my hands steady as I poured hot water, my face neutral, while inside I catalogued every word, every admission, every piece of evidence that proved their coordination. And I realized that by pretending to surrender, I'd become invisible to them again, just part of the furniture, someone whose presence didn't matter enough to warrant caution. And they were growing, careless, and careless people reveal truth without meaning to. Cameron announced over breakfast on a Saturday morning that he'd scheduled a checkup for me, saying casually while reading something on his phone, "Oh, I made you a doctor's appointment for next Wednesday. Just routine stuff. You know how insurance companies like regular checkups." And I set down my coffee carefully and asked, "Which doctor?" And he said, "Dr. Shepard, he's supposed to be excellent. Mom recommended him." And I felt my stomach clench because I'd been going to Dr. Wilson for 8 years, had no reason to change doctors, and any legitimate medical appointment would be with my established physician, not someone his mother recommended. And I asked, as neutrally as possible, "What kind of doctor is he?" And Cameron hesitated just a fraction too long before saying, "Family practice, general stuff." But his voice had that tight quality that meant he was lying. And I said pleasantly, "That's thoughtful, but I prefer to stick with Dr. Wilson. I'll call her office Monday and schedule my own checkup." And Cameron's face changed, irritation flickering across his features before he controlled it. And he said, "Mom already scheduled this one. It would be rude to cancel." And I smiled and said firmly, "I'll choose my own physician, Cameron. It's my health. I'll make my own appointment." And I stood and carried my plate to the sink. And behind me I heard him exhale sharply with frustration, and he got up and walked to his office without another word, and within minutes his phone was ringing, and I heard him answer. Yes, she refused. I don't know. She insists on seeing her own doctor. Okay, I'll let you know. And he emerged 20 minutes later looking stressed, and his phone rang again almost immediately, and when he answered his voice was tense. Mom, I told you she's... And he glanced at me and walked back to his office, closing the door harder than necessary, and I heard his voice rise once, frustrated, before going quiet again, and when he came out 15 minutes later, he looked at me with something new in his expression. Not anger exactly, but calculation. Like he was reassessing his approach, trying to figure out what had changed, why his formerly compliant wife was suddenly drawing boundaries, and I met his gaze calmly and said, I'm going to run some errands. Need anything? Keeping my tone light and normal, giving him no explanation, no justification, and he shook his head slowly, still watching me with that new wariness. And I grabbed my purse and left. And I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot for 10 minutes just breathing, my hands gripping the steering wheel, because refusing that appointment had been the first real line I'd drawn. The first open resistance. And now they knew I wasn't going to cooperate quietly, and I had no idea what they'd do next. Diane showed up at our house Sunday afternoon, and I heard her before I saw her. Her voice already raised as she walked through our front door that Cameron had opened. And she stormed into the living room where I was reading, and her pleasant mask was completely gone, replaced by cold fury, and she said, A wife should cooperate with her husband's decisions, Brooke. That's what marriage means, support, trust, not this constant questioning and resistance. And Cameron stood behind her in the doorway, and I saw in his posture that he was uncomfortable but not defending me. Not telling his mother she was out of line, just standing there like a child hiding behind his parents' authority. And I closed my book and looked at Diane directly and said calmly, I cooperate with my husband. What I don't do is give up my right to choose my own doctors or sign documents I don't understand without proper review. That's not resistance. That's basic self-respect. And Diane's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer. You're making this very difficult for everyone. We're trying to help you, to protect you, and you're acting like we're your enemies. And I stood up, matching her height, and said clearly, I never said you were my enemies, but I do get to make my own medical and financial decisions. That's not negotiable. And Diane's face went red, and she said loudly, You won't have these decisions much longer if you keep this up. And the threat hung in the air between us. And I said quietly but firmly, Leave my house, Diane. And she actually gasped like I'd slapped her. And she turned to Cameron. Are you going to let her speak to me this way? In your home? And I cut in before Cameron could respond. Our home. And yes, I can ask someone to leave our home when they're threatening me. And Cameron finally spoke, his voice weak. Mom, maybe you should. And Diane spun on him. Don't you dare side with her. And then she turned back to me and leaned close and said with venom, You won't have a house much longer, or anything else. We'll make sure of that. And she grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming our front door so hard a picture fell off the wall in the hallway. And Cameron and I stood in the silence she left behind. And he wouldn't meet my eyes. And I understood then that whatever came next would be worse, because I'd humiliated Diane in front of her son. And people like her don't forgive humiliation, they escalate. Monday morning, I called my own doctor's office and scheduled a complete physical examination. And when Dr. Wilson's receptionist asked if this was for any specific concern, I said I'd like comprehensive documentation of my current health status, including cognitive function, mental health assessment, the complete standard evaluation. And she paused, clearly picking up on something in my tone, and said she'd make a note for Dr. Wilson, and my appointment was scheduled for the following week. I spent my lunch break at work, making phone calls. First to our HR department, where I spoke to Natasha, who handled personnel files, and I said, I need to update my file to indicate that no information about employment should be released to anyone without my written authorization. And Natasha asked if everything was okay, and I said, just being cautious. And she made the notation, and I asked if she could email me confirmation, which she did within the hour. Then I went online and transferred exactly half of our joint savings account, my legal share, nothing more, into a new account at a different bank that only had my name on it, and I changed my direct deposit information, so my paychecks would now go to this new account, rather than our joint checking. And I updated all my passwords on every personal account I had: email, social media, banking, insurance, enabling two-factor authentication on everything, making sure Cameron couldn't access anything private anymore. I gathered documents from our home office during my lunch hours over the next few days. Copies of our marriage certificate, the house deed, car titles, tax returns for the past 3 years, insurance policies, investment statements, scanning everything and storing it in a secure cloud account that Cameron knew nothing about. And I did all of this calmly, methodically, legally. Nothing that could be questioned or challenged, just responsible financial management and personal security. The things anyone would do if they understood they needed to protect themselves. And by Wednesday evening, everything that could be secured was secured. And when Cameron got a notification that his paycheck had hit our joint account but mine hadn't, he confronted me immediately, saying, "Where's your direct deposit?" And I said simply, "I opened my own account," and his face went pale and then red. "Why would you do that?" And I answered calmly, "Because it's prudent to have separate accounts in addition to joint ones. It's actually good financial planning." And he stared at me like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize, and maybe he was. Cameron tried guilt first, sitting across from me at the kitchen table Thursday evening, his voice soft and wounded as he said, "I don't understand why you're doing this, playing these financial games, hiding money like I'm some kind of threat to you." And I looked at him directly and said, "I'm not hiding money. I transferred my share of our savings to my own account and redirected my paycheck. That's not hiding, that's managing my own finances, which is my right." And he shook his head. "But we've always shared everything. That's what marriage is. Why are you suddenly acting like we're enemies?" And I set down my water glass and said clearly, "Cameron, your mother brought me documents that would give you sole control of everything we own and label me as diminished capacity. You scheduled a doctor's appointment for me without asking, with a doctor I don't know and didn't choose. You've been taking calls from your mother's lawyer and lying about it. Those aren't the actions of a partner. Those are the actions of someone planning something, and I'm protecting myself until I understand what that something is." And his face went through several expressions: surprise that I knew about the lawyer, anger at being called out, and finally something that looked like desperation. "After everything my mother has done for us, helping with the down payment on this house, helping when I was between jobs, you're treating her like a villain." And I said quietly, "Your mother is trying to take legal control of my life, Cameron. That's not help. That's control." And he stood abruptly. "You know what? You're just proving exactly what we've been worried about. This paranoia, this hostility, this isn't normal, Brooke." And there it was, the narrative they'd constructed, thrown at me directly now. And he pulled out his phone, and I saw his hand shaking slightly as he typed something, and then he looked at me with something hard in his eyes and said, "If you don't sign those documents willingly and get that evaluation, they'll take it to court. Mom's lawyer says we have grounds for a competency hearing. Is that what you want? Public court records questioning your mental state?" And the threat was clear: cooperate or be humiliated publicly. And I felt fear spike through me, but I kept my voice steady as I said, "I'll take my chances with the truth in court over signing away my rights voluntarily." And Cameron stared at me like I'd become a stranger. And maybe I had. Maybe the wife who would have folded under that threat had finally learned to stand up straight. That evening, while Cameron was in the shower, his phone lit up on the bathroom counter, and I saw it through the open door, the screen glowing with a notification, and I moved closer, not touching it, just reading the preview that was visible without unlocking. "Mom's lawyer," it said at the top, and below that, "Guardianship route ready if needed. Documents prepared. Just need triggering incident or evaluation results." And my blood went cold because guardianship wasn't just about money or houses. Guardianship was about me, about legal authority over my person, about making me functionally a dependent with no rights to refuse treatment or make decisions about my own life. And I stepped back before Cameron came out, my mind racing. And later, after he'd fallen asleep, I lay awake in the dark staring at our ceiling. And I understood finally and completely that this wasn't just about financial control. They wanted full control. Wanted to make me legally incompetent. Wanted to strip every shred of autonomy I had. And the triggering incident they mentioned meant they were waiting for me to do something they could point to as evidence of instability. An emotional outburst, a confused moment, anything they could spin into proof of incompetence. And the evaluation wasn't meant to prove I was fine, it was meant to create documentation that I wasn't. Probably with a doctor they'd already prepared, already coordinated with, someone who would write what they needed written, regardless of reality. I thought about Cameron sleeping beside me, the man I'd trusted for 15 years, the man I'd built a life with, and I wondered when exactly he'd decided I was expendable, when he'd chosen his mother's control over our partnership. Or if he'd always been this person, and I'd simply never seen it clearly, because I'd never threatened his comfortable arrangement where his mother made the decisions, and I went along quietly. And I felt grief mixed with fear, mixed with anger. But mostly I felt determination. Because they weren't going to win this. I wasn't going to be made incompetent, I wasn't going to sign my life away, and I wasn't going to wait passively for them to make their next move. I was going to find the right help, and fight back, properly, legally, and I was going to win. I took a personal day from work on Friday and drove 40 minutes to the next town over, specifically choosing distance to avoid any overlap with Cameron's circles or his mother's friends. And I walked into the office of Patricia Hernandez, a family law attorney whose reviews emphasized her skill with financial coercion and elder abuse cases, and I told her everything in chronological order. The phone call with the contact name that didn't match, the documents Diane had brought, the conversation I'd overheard at 2 a.m, the hidden files on our computer, the guardianship route message, the threatening visits, all of it. And I brought printed screenshots, dates, names, and a timeline I'd created, and Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, her expression remaining professional, but her eyes showing recognition of something she'd clearly seen before. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and said, "This is textbook financial coercion with an attempted guardianship component. What they're doing is building a narrative to petition the court for authority over you, based on manufactured evidence of incompetence." And hearing it stated so plainly made my chest tight, and she continued, "The good news is that you've documented well. The bad news is that once they file a petition, even a baseless one, it creates a public record and puts you on the defensive." And I asked, "What do I do?" And Patricia leaned forward, her hands folded on her desk. "The strongest position isn't revenge, it's prevention and exposure through proper legal channels. We build an undeniable record of your competence. We formally establish your opposition to any unauthorized medical evaluations. We make it legally clear that any petition would be contested aggressively. And most importantly, we make them understand that going forward would expose their coordination in court, under oath, which most conspirators don't want." And she outlined a strategy that was clean and legal. Medical documentation from my established physician, employment records showing competence, financial records showing responsible management, and formal legal notices that would force everything into the light where lies couldn't survive scrutiny. And I left her office 90 minutes later with a retainer agreement signed and the first steps of a plan in motion. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't just defending myself blindly, but fighting back strategically. And that made all the difference. Patricia moved quickly, and by Tuesday I received a draft of a formal legal notice that she'd prepared to send to Cameron, to Diane, and to the law office whose name had appeared in the hidden files. And the notice was professional and precise, stating that all future communication regarding my health, finances, or legal status must go through my attorney, that I did not consent to any medical evaluation by providers I had not personally chosen, that I contested any characterization of diminished capacity, and that I was requesting immediate financial discovery regarding any documents or agreements that had been prepared using my name or identity without my knowledge or consent. The notice was legally airtight, threatening nothing but demanding everything stay above board. No hidden moves, no coordination behind my back, and Patricia explained, this forces them to either stop what they're doing or continue it in the open, where they can be held accountable. Most people operating in bad faith choose to stop, and she filed the notice with the court as well, creating a formal record that I was alert, represented, and unwilling to cooperate with any attempts to control me. And when Cameron received his copy by certified mail on Wednesday, he came home that evening with the envelope still unopened in his hand, and his face pale with shock. And he said, "You got a lawyer?" Like it was an act of war rather than self-defense. And I said calmly, "Yes, and all communication about these matters needs to go through my attorney now." And he stood there in our kitchen, the legal notice in his hand, and I could see him processing what this meant. That I wasn't confused or incompetent or easy to manipulate, that I'd been several steps ahead while he'd thought he was controlling the situation, that I had documentation and representation and wasn't going to fold under pressure. And his phone rang then, and he looked at the screen and I saw Mom's lawyer displayed clearly. And he looked at me with something like betrayal in his eyes before answering, "Yeah, I just got it. I don't know, yes, she has an attorney. I understand." And he hung up and stood there silently, and I realized the law office had just responded much faster than Patricia had anticipated, which meant they'd been waiting for exactly this kind of pushback, which meant they'd dealt with situations like this before, which made me wonder how many other women Diane had targeted over the years, how many other victims there'd been before me. Diane called Sunday morning and invited us to dinner at her house that evening, her voice sticky sweet on speakerphone when Cameron answered, saying, "I know things have been tense, but we're family, and family should talk things through properly, and I've invited your Uncle Frank and his wife Helen to join us, just a nice family dinner where we can all clear the air." And Cameron looked at me questioningly, and something in my gut said this was a setup, another play in their game, but I also understood that refusing would look like I was avoiding family, would be used as more evidence of my supposed instability, so I said, "That's fine, we'll be there." And I saw surprise flicker across Cameron's face because he'd expected me to refuse. And I spent the afternoon mentally preparing, reminding myself to stay calm, no matter what happened, to respond to accusations with facts, to be pleasant and reasonable and give them no ammunition. And we arrived at Diane's house at 6, and she greeted us with theatrical warmth, hugging Cameron and then hugging me like nothing had happened, like she hadn't threatened me in my own living room just days before. Dinner was elaborate, too elaborate for a casual family meal, and Frank and Helen were already there, sitting in Diane's formal dining room, and I noticed immediately that they were seated across from where Cameron and I would sit, positioned like observers or judges, and Diane served expensive wine and homemade lasagna and made pleasant conversation about nothing important, but I felt tension underneath every word, like everyone was waiting for something. And halfway through the meal, Diane shifted the conversation smoothly, saying, "Brooke, honey, we're all so worried about you lately. You've seemed so stressed and overwhelmed, and that's nothing to be ashamed of. We all go through difficult times." And I set down my fork and said calmly, "I'm not stressed or overwhelmed, Diane. I'm managing everything just fine." And she continued as if I hadn't spoken, "Frank and Helen have noticed it too, haven't you?" And she looked at them expectantly. And this was the trap I realized. She'd brought witnesses, people prepared to agree with whatever narrative she'd fed them. And Frank looked uncomfortable, but said carefully, "Well, Cameron mentioned you've been having some memory issues." And I looked directly at Frank and said clearly, "I haven't been having any memory issues. What specific incidents was Cameron referring to?" And Frank glanced at Cameron, who shifted in his seat, and Helen jumped in. "It's nothing specific, dear, just general concern from people who love you." And I recognized the tactic. Vague accusations that couldn't be proven or disproven, just establishing a pattern of concern in front of witnesses. I took a slow breath, let the silence stretch for a moment, and then said something Patricia had coached me on during our preparation call that morning. "If there are specific concerns about my behavior or memory, Please put them in writing, with dates and details, and I'll address each one directly. And the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, because that sentence did several things at once. It called their bluff on vague accusations. It requested documentation, which would require them to either lie specifically or admit they had nothing, and it made clear I wasn't intimidated or confused. And Diane's smile tightened and she said, "There's no need to be defensive, we're just trying to help." And I maintained my calm tone. "I'm not being defensive, I'm asking for specifics. If someone is concerned about my memory or behavior, I'd like to know exactly what incidents they're referring to so I can address them properly." "That seems reasonable." And Cameron said, "Brooke, this isn't a deposition," trying to lighten the mood, and I looked at him. "No, but if people are making claims about my mental state, I deserve to know what those claims are based on, don't you think?" And Helen looked at Diane uncertainly, clearly not prepared for me to push back so directly. And Diane tried to recover. "Well, for instance, Cameron mentioned you've been forgetting appointments and conversations." And I pulled out my phone and opened my calendar. "I haven't missed any appointments. Would you like to see my schedule? Or we could call my employer and confirm I haven't missed any work commitments. Or we could review my personal calendar. What specific appointment did I forget?" And Cameron's face was red now, and Diane's pleasant mask was cracking, and Frank cleared his throat and said, "Maybe we're all being a bit too formal here. This is just family concern." And I said gently, "I appreciate concern, Frank. I really do. But concern shouldn't be based on false information. If there are legitimate issues, let's document them properly so I can address them. If there aren't, then we should stop having this conversation." And the dinner continued awkwardly for another 30 minutes. But the dynamic had shifted. Because I'd stayed calm while they'd grown flustered, I'd requested specifics while they'd offered only vague accusations, and when we left, Diane hugged me at the door, but her eyes were cold. And she whispered, so only I could hear, "You think you're clever. You're not." And I whispered back, "Put it in writing," and walked to our car, and Cameron was silent the entire drive home, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and I knew I'd won that particular battle, but the war was far from over. What I didn't expect was the phone call from Cameron's Aunt Patricia, his father's sister, who I'd met only a handful of times at large family gatherings, who called me at work 3 days after the dinner and said without preamble, "We need to talk about Diane. Can you meet me for coffee?" And something in her tone made me agree immediately. And we met that afternoon at a small cafe on the edge of town, and Patricia was already there when I arrived. A woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a serious expression, and she slid a folder across the table toward me before I'd even sat down, saying, 23 years ago, Diane did this exact same thing to my brother's first wife, Cameron's father's first marriage that nobody talks about." And I felt my stomach drop as I opened the folder and found old letters, printed emails from the early days of email, handwritten notes, all documenting a pattern nearly identical to what I was experiencing. A wife being labeled as incompetent, documents being prepared to take control, a law office being involved, family members being recruited as witnesses. Patricia said quietly, her name was Anne, and she was a perfectly capable woman, a nurse, smart and independent, but Diane couldn't control her the way she wanted to, so she convinced my brother that Anne was having mental health issues. And she brought in the same attorney, yes, the same one you're dealing with now. And they nearly succeeded in getting guardianship before Anne's own family intervened, and she divorced my brother and disappeared. I tried to warn Cameron's father, but he was so deeply under Diane's influence he couldn't see what was happening. And by the time he did, Anne was gone, and Diane made sure we never heard from her again. And Patricia pulled out another sheet, a business card faded with age. "This is Anne's attorney from back then. She's retired now, but her firm is still operating and they kept the case files. Everything Diane did is documented there. The exact same pattern, the same tactics, even the same language about being concerned for the wife's well-being while simultaneously destroying her autonomy." And I stared at the documents spread before me, my hands trembling slightly, because this was proof that Diane was a serial manipulator, that I wasn't her first victim. And Patricia said, I wanted to contact you sooner, but I didn't know how. And when I heard about the dinner at Diane's house and how she was setting you up, I knew I had to reach out. Use this. Protect yourself. Don't let her do to you what she did to Anne. And I gathered the documents carefully, thanked Patricia with tears in my eyes, and drove straight to my attorney's office. Patricia Hernandez read through the documents from Cameron's aunt with growing intensity. And when she finished, she looked up at me and said, This is gold. This establishes a pattern of behavior, shows premeditation, proves this isn't about legitimate concern, but about control. And most importantly, it involves the same attorney, which means he's been complicit in this type of coercion before. And she immediately began drafting what she called a protective motion, which was a legal filing asking the court to prevent any medical evaluation or guardianship petition from proceeding without proper evidentiary basis. And attached to the motion were my medical records from Dr. Wilson showing perfect health, my employment records showing excellent performance, my financial records showing responsible management, the text message screenshot about the guardianship route, the screenshots of hidden files from our home computer, and now the documentation of Diane's previous attempt to do this exact thing to another woman. And Patricia explained, This motion says, this person has attempted this before. Here's the pattern, here's the evidence of coordination, here's the proof that the target is actually completely competent, and therefore any attempt to pursue guardianship is malicious and should be sanctioned. And she filed the motion that afternoon, and served copies on Cameron, Diane, and most importantly, on the law office representing them, and the response came faster than I'd ever seen a lawyer respond. Within 2 hours, the opposing attorney called Patricia's office directly, and Patricia put him on speaker with my permission so I could hear. And his tone was completely different from what I'd expected. Not aggressive, but almost apologetic, saying, Ms. Hernandez, I've reviewed your motion and the attached documentation. I'd like to discuss a resolution that doesn't involve court proceedings. Which was lawyer speak for, please don't make this public because my client and I both look terrible. And Patricia said coolly, My client is open to resolution provided all attempts to control her legally or financially cease immediately, in writing, with consequences for violation. And he agreed to a meeting. And I understood then that the pattern evidence had scared him. That having his involvement in a previous similar case exposed would damage his reputation badly. And predators rely on shadows. Once you shine light on what they're doing, once you make it public and documented, they usually scatter because the cost of continuing becomes too high. Cameron broke that evening, and I don't mean he got angry or defensive. I mean something in him actually cracked. And I came home from work to find him sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and when he looked up his eyes were red like he'd been crying, and he said in a voice I'd never heard before, small and defeated, I didn't mean for it to go this far, Brooke. I never wanted this. And I set down my purse and stood in the doorway, not moving closer, and I said, Then why did you let it happen? And he shook his head. My mother. She's always been this way. Always knew what was best, and when she said you were having problems, when she showed me articles about cognitive decline and told me I needed to protect you before you made bad decisions, I believed her because I've always believed her. And by the time I realized she was manufacturing problems that didn't exist, we were already meeting with lawyers and drafting documents. And she said if I backed out now I'd lose everything, the house, my inheritance, everything. And there it was, the truth under the manipulation. Cameron wasn't evil, he was weak, controlled by his mother, through fear of financial loss, and he'd chosen protecting his inheritance over protecting his wife. But he'd made that choice repeatedly, every single time he'd lied, every time he'd taken that phone call, every time he'd stood silent while his mother threatened me, and I said quietly, You kept answering that call, Cameron. Every single time it rang. You answered it and went along with whatever she was planning, and you did it knowing it would hurt me. And he looked up, his face desperate. Because she said I'd lose everything if I didn't. The down payment on this house was actually a loan. Did you know that? Not a gift. A a loan that she holds the note on, and she said if I didn't cooperate, she'd call it due immediately and we'd lose the house. And I was scared. And I felt something twist in my chest that might have been sympathy, except he'd let that fear turn him into someone who'd tried to have his own wife declared incompetent. And I said, "So you chose the house over me. You chose money over partnership. You chose your mother's control over our marriage." And he whispered, "I was wrong. I see that now. I'll tell her it's over, that I won't help her anymore." But I shook my head. "It's already over, Cameron. The question now is what comes next." And I walked upstairs to the bedroom we'd shared for 15 years and started packing a bag, not dramatically, just efficiently, because staying in that house felt impossible now. And Cameron followed me, standing in the doorway, and he didn't try to stop me, but he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And I believed he meant it. But apologies don't undo damage, they just acknowledge it, and the damage here was irreparable. The next morning I woke in a hotel room I'd paid for with my own account, and I checked my email to find a message from Patricia with the subject line, "Development." And when I opened it, I saw that Diane had made one last, desperate move overnight. She'd gone to our bank and attempted to freeze our joint checking account, claiming I was draining marital funds, and that the bank needed to protect the account from my unstable financial decisions. And she'd presented herself as Cameron's mother, acting on his behalf, and the bank, to their credit, had refused to freeze the account without a court order, and had instead flagged Diane's attempt as suspicious activity and notified both account holders, meaning Cameron and me. And I had the bank's automated email showing the exact time of her attempt and the reason given. And Patricia had already filed an emergency motion showing this attempt as further evidence of Diane's pattern of trying to control me. And she'd also sent a strongly worded letter to the bank's legal department pointing out that Diane had no authority over my accounts, and that her attempt to freeze them could constitute financial abuse. The bank responded by permanently noting in our account that Diane Morrison had no authorization to make any inquiries or changes, and they'd actually upgraded our account security based on the attempted interference. And Patricia called me mid-morning saying, this was exactly the wrong move for her to make. It's documented, it's recent, it shows ongoing attempts to control your finances, and it makes her look desperate and overreaching. And the timing, right after our protective motion was filed, makes it look like retaliation. And I felt a grim satisfaction because Diane had panicked, had acted rashly instead of strategically, and she just handed us another piece of evidence that she was the problem, not me. And Patricia said the opposing attorney had called again that morning, his tone even more conciliatory, suggesting mediation and discussing how all parties could move forward without further legal action, which meant they knew they'd lost and were trying to minimize damage. And I told Patricia I wasn't interested in mediation. I was interested in clear legal documentation that all attempts to control me were over, permanently, with consequences if they tried again. And she said, I'll draft that agreement today. And I thanked her and ended the call and sat in that hotel room, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, but the solid ground of knowing I'd done everything right, that gathered every piece of evidence, made every legal move properly, and I was winning not through manipulation or cruelty, but through simple, documented truth. The court date came 3 weeks later, and I dressed carefully in a professional navy suit, pulled my hair back neatly, and arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early with Patricia beside me. And we sat on a bench in the hallway, waiting while other cases were called. And I saw Cameron arrive with his attorney, and he looked thin and tired. And he glanced at me once with something like regret before looking away. And then Diane swept in, wearing expensive clothes and perfect makeup. And she saw me, and her face arranged itself into an expression of wounded dignity, like she was the victim here. And we were called into the courtroom, and I sat at the plaintiff's table with Patricia, and Cameron and Diane sat at the defendant's table with their attorney, and the judge reviewed the motions and counter-motions, and Diane's attorney stood and began making the case that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mrs. Morrison had only been concerned about her daughter-in-law's well-being, that sometimes families disagree about what constitutes help versus interference. And the judge listened without expression. And then Patricia stood and methodically laid out the timeline. The hidden documents proposing to strip me of financial control, the guardianship route text message, the attempted medical evaluation with a doctor I hadn't chosen, the midnight conversation about documenting my supposed forgetfulness, the bank freeze attempt just 3 weeks ago. And then, carefully, she introduced the evidence about Anne, Cameron's father's first wife, and the nearly identical pattern Diane had executed 23 years earlier using the same attorney. The courtroom went very quiet, and the judge looked at Diane's attorney and said, "Counselor, are you the same attorney who represented Mrs. Morrison in a similar matter in 2001? And the attorney went pale and said carefully, "I may have represented her in a family matter around that time, Your Honor." And the judge said, "A family matter involving a petition for conservatorship of her then daughter-in-law, which was withdrawn when the daughter-in-law obtained representation and threatened to expose the coordination." And there was silence. And then the judge turned to Cameron and said in a tone that cut through the formal atmosphere, "Mr. Patterson, why was guardianship discussed at all regarding your wife? What medical emergency or demonstrated incapacity prompted these discussions?" And Cameron opened his mouth and closed it, and finally said quietly, "There wasn't one, Your Honor. My mother suggested it as a precaution." And the judge's expression hardened. A precaution against what? Against your wife exercising her legal rights? Against her choosing her own doctors? Against her managing her own finances? And Cameron had no answer. The judge denied any potential future petition for conservatorship or guardianship without significant medical evidence from multiple independent physicians, warned Diane explicitly against further harassment or interference in my life, with the note that violation would result in restraining orders and possible sanctions, ordered that all marital assets be divided through proper legal proceedings with both parties represented, and most satisfyingly, ordered Diane and her attorney to pay my legal fees as the prevailing party in what the judge termed an attempt to circumvent proper legal process through intimidation and manufactured evidence. And I watched Diane's face go white and then red as the judge spoke, and her attorney stood there taking the judicial rebuke with visible discomfort. And when the judge finished and dismissed us, Diane stood abruptly and walked out without looking at anyone, her back rigid with fury, and Cameron approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom and said, "I'm sorry. For all of it. I should have protected you instead of going along with her." And I looked at him. This man I'd spent 15 years with, and I felt nothing but exhausted relief that it was over. And I said, "I hope you find a way to live your own life instead of the one she decides for you." And I turned and walked away with Patricia beside me, and we stepped out into bright May sunshine, and Patricia said, "You won." Cleanly, legally, completely. And I took a deep breath of free air and said, "I know." And over the next months, Cameron and I divorced quietly. Assets divided exactly 50-50 through proper legal channels. No drama, no more manipulation, just the legal dissolution of a marriage that had been broken the moment my husband chose his mother's control over our partnership. And I moved into a small apartment across town, started therapy to process everything I'd been through, reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from during my marriage, and slowly rebuilt my life on my own terms. I kept my job, proved every day through my work that I was exactly as competent as I'd always been, and eventually the fear faded and was replaced by something stronger. The absolute certainty that I could protect myself. That documentation and truth would win over manipulation and lies, and that walking away from people who try to control you isn't giving up, it's choosing yourself. And I didn't take anything that wasn't rightfully mine. I didn't destroy anyone out of revenge. I just refused to be stolen from, refused to surrender my autonomy, refused to sign away my power, no matter how much pressure they applied. And in the end, that refusal, that simple, stubborn insistence on my own rights, was enough. And that's the lesson that changed everything. You don't have to destroy your enemies, you just have to refuse to be destroyed. And truth documented properly will always, eventually, win.